Welcome to or welcome back to my channel. This is your host, G.I. Wingnut, and I just want to go ahead and throw a special shout out to Laura over there at Magical Mystery Church for bringing today's topic, which I will get into momentarily. I'm going to try to get all this stitched together nice and smooth because, yeah, I'm going to have to do it in multiple parts. Real life happens. Anyway, let's see about going ahead and getting on into this story. So, what is it Laura brought to my attention? Well, to the world's attention. It would be the CIA here, use of journalists and clergy in intelligence operations. A Senate hearing that was held back in 1996. So let's kind of look into this, and I've got some thoughts I'm going to share along the way, which is why I'm probably going to need to do this in multiple pieces, but I am going to try to stitch them together as neatly as I possibly can. So, as this cover of this article says, or this transcript says, CIA's use of journalists and clergy in intelligence operations. And you can see up here, Senate hearing 104-593. That would be the 104th Congress. As we can see later in the header here, it's in the second session, and it was held on Wednesday, July 17th, 1996. And we've got the Superintendent of Documents Depository, February 19th, 1997, which is when it would have been registered into the library. So there we go on that. We got a couple of blank pages here. Oh, no, just one blank page. Repeat of the cover sheet. And we've got some interesting characters here. Now, I want you to specifically notice that the chairman here, Mr. Spector, Arlen Spector, I don't know if you remember him from history. I may have to go back and do a breakdown on some of these characters. But anyway, so we've got Chairman Arlen Spector, and we've got the Vice Chairman is J. Robert Carey. Arlen being from Pennsylvania and Mr. Carey being from Nebraska. And we've got some other names up there. You can read them for yourself. I'm not going to really get into that because we got a lot to cover here. But these are some names that we will come back to. And then here on the table of contents, we've got the hearing and so on, statements from individuals. We'll get to those as well as the supplemental materials. I will try to remember to put the link below. If nothing else, I will for sure put it on the community tab. Unless you're watching this on Rumble. In which case I should be able to get everything in the description. Anyway, moving right ahead. CIA's use of journalists and clergies in intelligence operations, Wednesday, July 17th, 1996. U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, Washington, D.C. The Select Committee met pursuant to notice at 10:09 a.m. in room SH-216 in the Hart Senate Building. The Honorable Arlen Spector, Chairman of the committee, presiding. Present, Senators Arlen Spector, Senator Spector, Carey of Nebraska, Glenn Carey of Massachusetts, and Rob. Also present, Charles Battaglia, Staff Director, Chris Straub, Minority Staff Director, Suzanne Spalding, Chief Counsel, Kathleen McGee, Chief Clerk. Opening statement given by Chairman Spector. Quote, the Senate Select Intelligence Committee hearing will proceed. We regret the necessity to reschedule from 9:30 to 10 a.m. and we're just a few minutes after 10 a.m. now. That was required because Senator Carey, Senator Glenn, and I and others had been in a meeting with Director Deutsch as a matter of fact and at the Pentagon on issues arising from the bombing of Tehran back on June 25th. We will now proceed with the hearing on what public policy ought to be with respect to the issue of the use of journalists or clergy or Peace Corps representatives by the CIA. This matter came into prominence earlier this year on a collateral discussion in one of the reports, and then the matter was discussed briefly by the committee with the distinguished director. There had been quite a concern expressed by a number of people in the news media. The House of Representatives has since taken a vote on the subject as the prohibition of use of journalists and others by the CIA. It is a matter which the committee thinks requires some analysis and the determination of public policy, perhaps by the Congress, or at least a consideration of that. There has been a meeting with journalist and director Deutsch, and a number of people have come to some terms which at least some thought satisfactory. But it's a matter for the Congress as to what the public policy of the U.S. government ought to be. There have been some suggestions that the issue should be decided only by the director, not even by the deputy director. There have been some other suggestions that the matter ought to be decided only by the president. That's a matter of that. It's a matter of that importance, and that it ought to take the analogy of a finding as with covert activity, so that the very specific and a really high level showing of necessity before journalists or Peace Corps operators or clergy could be used by the CIA. Thought interjection here. I wonder if all that was considered when they... Oh, wait a minute. This is in 96. Paul Kane was, what, back in the 50s and 60s? And on into the 70s? All right. Back to the statement from Chairman Specter. There's been some other thinking that ought to be limited, or that it ought to be limited to a specific period of time, and that if the exception is to be made, the waiver of the prohibition, waiver by the president, that it ought to be a matter of national security interest, as we have many laws which involve prohibitions but provide for special exception on the waiver on a finding by the president of a national security issue. There's a certain concern about even a discussion of these matters that are to any extent publicly, because it gives currency and publicity to this kind of an issue. But I think those who would retaliate and those who would make an example of journalists, as they did of Terry Anderson, who will be a witness here today, those people are fully aware of this potential. Another thought interjection. Julian Assange, maybe. I'm sure there's others that I just can't think of off the top of my head, but anyway, back to the statement. It's a matter of considerable interest, and there ought to be a public consideration, congressional consideration, to try to formulate a policy. We have a very distinguished group of witnesses this morning. Senator Paul Coverdell will be our lead witness in accordance with our practice to give deference to members. Senator Coverdell brings a unique experience as having been the director of the Peace Corps. He had asked the Peace Corps to send a representative here today, and that was not, I'm not sure quite why not, but it was not doable or not convenient. We have the Distinguished Director of Central Intelligence, Don Deutsch, who we have a group of distinguished journalists, as I said. Mr. Anderson, who was kept by terrorists for some 6 years between 1985 and 1991 because they thought he was a spy, a CIA spy. We have a distinguished journalist from Nightline, Mr. Ted Koppel of ABC News. Ken Adelman, who had an extensive governmental experience, is now a columnist at the Washington Times and chairman and editor-in-chief, of the U.S. News and World Report, Mort Zuckerman. Then we have a panel from Dr. Don Argue, president of the National Association of Evangelicals, to be accompanied by Mr. John Orme, executive director of the International Foreign Mission Association, Sister Claudette LaVerdiere, president of Maryknoll Sisters, and Dr. Rodney Page, deputy secretary general of the Church World Service and witness unit of the National Council of Churches. We start with our distinguished colleague, Senator Coverdell, after we have a statement by Senator Kerry, our vice chairman. So, moving right on into Vice Chairman Kerry's statement. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the first of all, I just have two brief observations. The first is that I'm very uncomfortable with any public discussion of U.S. intelligence sources and methods. I recognize that our committee did not create this topic as a public issue, that it's been a matter of great concern not only to the media but also to the House Intelligence Committee. Not this committee, and that much of what we're doing is in response to our concern, as well as a provision on this topic that has been placed in the House Authorization Bill. Nonetheless, I don't see how public discussion of which Americans are or are not authorized to be helpful to their country as intelligence assets will improve the quality of U.S. intelligence. Much of the discussion that we just had with the Department of Defense centered on why didn't we know? Why weren't we able to find out what terrorists had in mind in regards to Americans deployed in Saudi Arabia? How come we weren't able to find out? Well, that is not likely. Those questions are not likely to be answered as a consequence of us reading the morning newspaper or watching the evening news or going down to the Saudi Arabia Chamber of Commerce and having a discussion about what's going on. Hang on a second. I got to interject a thought here. It's June 2nd, 2024, and just a few days ago, like within the last couple of weeks, I understand that there was some information leaked about how Saudi Arabia was allegedly actually involved in the 9/11 Twin Towers incident. Anyway, getting back to the statements. Second, Mr. Kerry says, I may risk being politically incorrect in saying so, but I simply don't see why any profession should be completely and permanently excluded from the possibility of working with the CIA or DIA. The determining factors should be the situation and the willingness of the individual. If lives are at risk or a vital national interest is at risk, I don't see why any American patriot should be forbidden to cooperate with an American intelligence agency. As I understand Director Deutsch's policy, I support it. We have some very convincing people as witnesses today, but I must say, Mr. Chairman, it will be hard to move me from my present viewpoint. Thank you very much, Senator Kerry. Senator Glenn, would you like to make an opening comment? Senator Glenn responds with, I don't have any formal opening statement, Mr. Chairman. I think these hearings are very appropriate now because in a way, we're into a new day of new kinds of warfare internationally. We're into international terrorism and so on. We can't send satellites over and all at once pick up on what's going on. We're into a time when human intelligence is going to be more important than I think it's been for a long, long time. And that's the toughest kind to develop. I guess, having said that, I see it as an individual choice. I sort of agree with what Senator Kerry said, that I wouldn't rule it in or out. If people feel they have information that's going to save lives, or the intelligence community thinks that we need to learn a little more, that this particular person, be he or she clergy, journalist, or whatever, they want to approach somebody, and if that person is willing, they don't have to any more than senators have to, or anybody else. But leave it open as an individual choice as to the importance of what and how the individuals feel. But just have a policy that says we will under no circumstances, no how, no way, even think of talking to the clergy or those associated with religious groups overseas or journalists. I think that would be a wrong policy too, because we're into a tough time for human intelligence, as I'm sure Director Deutsch will comment upon in a few minutes. So, I agree with the statement that Senator Kerry just made. Thank you very much. Chairman Arlen Specter says, thank you, Senator Glenn. Now, we turn to our distinguished colleague, Senator Paul Coverdell of Georgia. Statement of the Honorable Paul Coverdell, a U.S. Senator from the state of Georgia. Senator Coverdell's quote, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I don't know what the decision apparatus was at the Peace Corps other than that their director is in the Dominican Republic and that may have related to their decision to not be here. Let me say as forcefully as I know how that I would hope that the committee could conclusively set the Peace Corps aside as quickly as possible from this discussion. The issue was debated extensively by the founding apparatus, very carefully thought through, and I think resolved in an appropriate way. It would be, in my judgment, exceedingly dangerous for our volunteers to be included in a context in which they may be representatives of the CIA. We have operating documents between the State Department, CIA, and the Peace Corps outlining this policy. I think it's been prudently dealt with. A director, for example, or an employee and their principals, if they were ever operatives of the CIA, they are not eligible to be director of the U.S. Peace Corps. If there is an intelligence background for the previous 10 years, it would preempt you. I think it is a sound policy. By way of background, I was director of the Peace Corps for the majority of the Bush presidency, from its inception to near its end. I was director of the Peace Corps at the time we were entering Eastern Europe in unprecedented numbers. Even 35 years later, as director, I was confronted with assurances over and over that this was not an intelligence apparatus. I remember vividly meeting the Solidarity Vice Minister of Education on a cold, rainy day in Warsaw. It was in the building that had been left by the Germans. It was the Gestapo headquarters of all places. About halfway through the presentation, he said, "I hope you will forgive me, but I am ordered to ask you this question. Are these volunteers associated with the CIA?" And I could very comfortably say, no, they are not. You would raise the doubt across the entire Corps just by this kind of discussion. And you put at risk the Corps. We lost a volunteer at a program that opened in Bolivia simply because there was a mistaken view that the woman was associated with the DEA. This is a life or death matter here. I think the current policy is appropriate. I think I understand the public discussion, but I remain gravely concerned about it and would hope that a resolution could come quickly in the public discourse, and that there would be a ratification of the contemporary policy for the credibility of the Corps. The years that have been invested in achieving this credibility and for the safety of the Corps. I feel very strongly about it. I've confronted it repeatedly. As you may or may not know, the Peace Corps has even separated from the normal compound. It has its own facility to reinforce these policies. It is long-standing. It has worked well for us. And I can see no achievement that would be accomplished that could not be done through other apparatus and options. So, I have no doubt about this in my mind. I understand you are always going to have a debate about important questions such as this. But it would be wrong-headed to change the policy. Mr. Chairman, I would be glad to respond to any questions that you may have. And Chairman Arlen Specter says, just a question or two, Senator Coverdell. You refer to the current policy with respect to the Peace Corps. I think it would be useful if you would state it specifically for the record. Senator Coverdell responds, it is embraced in a letter of April 2nd, 1984, which I have in part. I can get the entire letter for you. But I would read the salient provisions under eligibility. Chairman Specter, let's turn on the clock. I should have started it earlier, 5 minutes per round. Should have started it for witnesses and senators, but we will try to limit the comments of senators to 5 minutes and opening statements to 5 minutes to leave the maximum amount of time for questions and answers. Senator Coverdell. All right, Mr. Chairman. It says permanent ineligibility. Persons currently or formerly employed by the Central Intelligence Agency shall be permanently ineligible for the Peace Corps volunteer service or employment by the Peace Corps. Now, ineligibility for a minimum of 10 years. Any person who has been employed by an agency or division of an agency other than the Central Intelligence Agency a substantial part of whose mission has been determined by the Peace Corps General Council to include intelligence activities, shall be ineligible for service as a volunteer or for employment for a period of 10 years from the last date of employment by such agency. Ineligibility for a period in excess of 10 years. Individuals may be ineligible for service or employment for a period in excess of 10 years where the General Council determines that their background or work history with regard to intelligence activity warrants such action. Related work. Applicants for Peace Corps volunteer service or employment whose background or work history discloses a substantial connection with the intelligence intelligence activity or related work other than through employment shall be ineligible to serve as Peace Corps volunteers or employees of the Peace Corps for a period of time ordinarily not to exceed 10 years from the date of their last connection with the agency or activity. And it goes on, but I think Chairman Specter says, I see, that's the Corps. Thank you, Senator Coverdell. There is a contention. Chairman Specter says, I see, that's the Corps. Thank you, Senator Coverdell. There is a contention, and we have the Director Deutsch's prepared comments. So, we see that he's crafted what is proposed is very, very limited exception to the prohibition, and that the limited exception arises as he articulates it in two situations: saving the lives of hostages or information which would suggest a terrorist use of weapons of mass destruction or great risk of Americans or the lives of others. Interjection here. Weapons of mass destruction. General Colin Powell. Anyway, moving right back along in one here. Would you Chairman Specter asks, would you consider any exceptions to the prohibition you have articulated? Senator Coverdell responds, no, because once you establish the exception, it is in the mind of the host country from that point forward, of the potential of it. I just feel that given the size of our intelligence community and the assets that the United States have, it can operate apart from embroiling this agency and the people there, and I think putting them at great risk. Senator Specter asks, does the prohibition you have articulated serve to protect Peace Corps volunteers from the suspicion of being FBI agents as a practical matter? Senator Coverdell, absolutely. It is designed to reinforce our contention from day to day that those volunteers are not in a capacity of assistance and mutual understanding, that they are not part of an intelligence community. When the Peace Corps was first founded, of course, this was an enormous obstacle to overcome, and it has remained so. To the credit of the agency and the Central Intelligence Agency and the intelligence community, we have mutually been able to protect these volunteers and its mission successfully with a few limitations. You know, these are people without assets. They are it's a very difficult situation we would be putting these Americans in if they were to violate it. Violate it on one point and you've done it across the board. Chairman Specter. Senator Coverdell, we very much appreciate your joining us. Thank you very much for your testimony. Senator Coverdell. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Specter, I would like to now call the distinguished Director of the Central Intelligence, Director of Central Intelligences, the Honorable John Deutsch. Welcome, Director Deutsch. We appreciate you coming again today. We again commend you for your distinguished service as Director of Central Intelligence and look forward to your comments. All right, so let's go ahead and get into this statement of the Honorable John M. Deutsch, Director of Central Intelligence. Director Deutsch, speaking his statement. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appear this morning at your request to explain the policy of the Central Intelligence Agency concerning the possible use of American journalists, American clergy, or Peace Corps members. As you know, Mr. Chairman, I am uneasy discussing potential intelligence sources in a public session, but I am in a position to make some general statements in this very sensitive issue. Very sensitive issue. Yeah, sidebar there. Anyway, moving right along with this statement. Simply put, the Central Intelligence Agency policy is not to use organizations, American clergy. I'm sorry. Let me start that again. Simply put, the Central Intelligence Agency policy is not to use journalists accredited to American news organizations, their parent organizations, American clergy, or the Peace Corps for intelligence purposes. This includes any use of such organizations for cover. The policy that I just stated, Mr. Chairman, has been in place for some 20 years. Recently, 19 more years more precisely. Interjection here. Given that this would have happened in 1996, 19 years prior, let's see, that would have been 1977, right? Yeah, that would have been 1977. Colonia Dignidad. This nifty little site over here, connection to William Branham. Anyway, that's something we can dive into more at another time. I've got a video I'll tag on to the end of all this to help explain it real quick. Anyway, recently, 19 years more precisely, recently at the request of this committee, I received the policy to determine whether it was both appropriate and sufficiently circumscribed. As I told you, Mr. Chairman, and this committee, when this issue was raised with me, my sympathy is on the side of the no intelligence use of American journalists or clergy. I strongly believe in the independence of our free press and the division between government and the church. Yeah, and that is why I have stated publicly that I have no intention of using either American journalists or clergy for intelligence purposes. Interesting. Paul Kane? Anyway, moving along. Further, as this committee knows, I have no circumstances, or I found no circumstances while I am Director of Central Intelligence that have caused me to do either. But, Mr. Chairman, as the Director of Central Intelligence, I must be in a position to assure the President and the members of the National Security Council and this country that there will never come a time when the United States cannot ask a witting citizen, knowledgeable citizen, to assist in combating an extreme threat to the nation. So I, like all my predecessors for the last 19 years, have arrived at the conclusion that the agency should not be prohibited from considering the use of American journalists or clergy in exceptional circumstances. Huh, huh. I wonder what he considers exceptional circumstances. It's an interesting turn of phrase. He goes on to say, I am able to imagine circumstances, Mr. Chairman, in which the lives of American hostages depend upon particular knowledge only a journalist might have or obtain. I can foresee the possibility of a terrorist group attempting to use a weapon of mass destruction in a crowded urban area where both the president and the nation would look to the agency to use all possible measures, all possible means to detect and deter such an event. How did that work out for the Boston Marathon bombing? How did that work out for 9/11, which was what, 5 years after this, give or take? Oh boy. Anyway, back to his statement. Under either of these scenarios, I believe it is reasonable to foreclose the Central Intelligence Agency asking. Okay, let me try that again. Under either of these scenarios, I believe it is unreasonable to foreclose the Central Intelligence Agency asking an American citizen with their knowledge to help be a source of information. Huh. Narky narc narc? Anyway. Now, critics of this discussion might well say that these are far-fetched examples in which the possible confluence of highly improbably circumstances. Hang on, what? Now, critics of this decision might well say that these are far-fetched examples in which the possible confluence of highly improbably circumstances is fanciful when weighed against the possible suspicion that it puts clergy and journalists, Peace Corps volunteers who are abroad at risk. Unfortunately, recent history has shown that the threat in these scenarios is very real. I do not believe that as director of the Central Intelligence that I can gamble that that future sources of critical information will come only from predictable sources. Nothing in my 14 months in this job supports that kind of judgment. Having decided that I should allow the possibility of exceptional waivers, I looked carefully at your request, at the guidelines which govern such waivers. I found them restrictive but non-specific. I have, therefore, issued new policy guidelines which set out several specific tests that must be satisfied before the director or deputy director may consider a waiver. These guidelines have been available to both both intelligence committees. They are clarified, and I am available to discuss them in any detail the committee may wish in closed session, always behind closed doors. But I want to state, he goes on to say, that the guidelines require prompt as well as periodic notification of the Intelligence Committee in those extraordinary circumstances when an exception to the policy might be granted. Let me repeat. These guidelines allow for the possibility of a waiver, but they do not compel or encourage such waivers. I have not changed my view that it would take extremely rare, indeed highly improbable circumstances to change my predilection against any waiver of our policy not to use journalists, not to use clergy for intelligence purposes. There is one other aspect of this question that deserves comment in this public session, which is who ought to be the official entrusted with the responsibility to decide whether to waive this policy. I considered whether the president ought to be the decision maker. In the end, we decided such decisions should remain with the director. The director is the official entrusted with running intelligence operations. The director ought to be responsible for this operational, albeit extremely important decision in those rare situations where it might be contemplated. If the director fails to give the direct proper attention or judgment, the director can be overruled or fired by his boss, the president. Let me return for a moment to the Peace Corps. Here too, our policy is not to use Peace Corps personnel for intelligence purposes. This has not changed, and here any waiver could occur under even more circumscribed circumstances. Last, I would like to close by commenting on the Richardson Amendment adopted by the House. The Richardson Amendment requires that the President decide any waiver on the intelligence use of an American journalist. I have said, as I believe, this gives the President greater flexibility to overrule judgments if this decision rests with the director. The Richardson Amendment also excludes cases of voluntary cooperation between the agency and a particular journalist. Like Tucker Carlson, maybe? Just a side thought there. This is important because we would never contemplate a relationship without the witting and willing cooperation of the individual involved. Mr. Chairman, this completes my statement, and I am happy to answer any questions you may have that are appropriate in a public hearing, and of course, I will be pleased to provide any additional details you may wish in a closed session. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Spector says, thank you, Director Deutsch. We shall proceed to the issue of the guidelines in closed session. If any questions arise in this open session, which you would prefer to defer to closed session, please feel free to do that. The statute, which was adopted by the House last month by an overwhelming vote of 417 to 6, provides that an element of the intelligence community may not use as an agent or asset for the purposes of collecting information any individual who, number one, is authorized by contract or by issuance of press credentials to represent himself or herself either in the United States or abroad as a correspondent of the U.S. News Media Organization, or is officially organized by a foreign government as a representative of the U.S. Media Organization. And the Richardson Amendment, which you have referred to, proposes to, and this was enacted, strike an element of and insert a policy. It is the policy of the United States and an element of waiver. The President may waive subsection A in the case of an individual if the President certifies in writing that the waiver is necessary to address the overriding national security interests of the United States. The certification shall be made to the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence of the House of Representatives and the Select Committee on Intelligence of the Senate. Under subsection C, voluntary cooperation provides that subsection A shall not be construed to prohibit the voluntary cooperation of a person who is aware of the cooperation, or that the cooperation is being provided to an element of the United States intelligence community. This issue has not yet been considered by the U.S. Senate, and we are looking at the House determination to lodge that authority in the president. Your proposal is that it will be with the director, and that is not an assistant or any designee of the director, but limited to the director himself, herself. Director Deutsch says, Mr. Chairman, as I think you know, I believe that big agencies require the director and deputy director to be working together. The director is frequently absent. The deputy director has to be in a position on all matters to act for the director. So, if you say director, I always mean by the director and the deputy director, because the deputy director acts with authority in the director's absence. Chairman Specter says, well, when the director and deputy director are absent, who acts as acting director? Director Deutsch says, I don't think such circumstances arise sufficiently frequently to consider them. There is always either the director or the deputy director that are present. Chairman Specter says, so your standard would be to exclude any third party beyond the director or deputy director. Director Deutsch says that's correct. Chairman Specter, Director Deutsch, you talked about journalists and clergy. Would you include in that the Peace Corps? Director Deutsch, yes. The criteria, the conditions for the Peace Corps are slightly different, but are essentially the same. As was mentioned by Senator Coverdell, there is an additional document, an agreement, undertaken some years back, which governs this. They are essentially the same. We do not have any case ever thinking about the use in policy terms of the active Peace Corps volunteer. The regulations, which could be waived here, concern the measures that he read about, ex-Peace Corps volunteers, and restraints on them. Chairman Specter responds, Director Deutsch, you said publicly that you have not used any of these categories of individuals by the CIA during your tenure. And it is generally accepted that this is a very, very unusual or extraordinary circumstance. And we do not have on public record, nor will we put on public record, where such usage has been made. The presumption is that it isn't done. Okay. Considering the infrequency and considering the sensitivity, why not elevate this particular matter to a level of a finding for covert action? A covert action has a very special place in the national security laws, requiring that the president make a finding, that it be in writing, so that there is no issue as to a causelessness or casualness, or indirection or delegation, only by the president. The notification is given to the Intelligence Committee of the finding, and we have periodic oversight on such covert action. In light of the sensitivity of this issue and its infrequent use, not particularly burdensome for the president, why not adopt the overwhelming view of the House and leaving to the president with his waiver for an exception for rational securities, which we have in so many sensitive legal matters. Cat, stop. All right. Director Deutsch responds, well, I believe that there are two compelling reasons for not doing so, perhaps three. The first is that the Director of Central Intelligence should be considered responsible for operational management of human intelligence activities of this country, the human collection activities of this country. If there is any doubt about the ability or the judgment of the then sitting Director of Central Intelligence to make such operational judgments, that the individual should be replaced. Second, I think that it is very important to leave room between a decision that the director takes and the president to have executive oversight. And should the president see the director make a decision in this matter that should be overturned, the president can do so. And indeed he can, on that matter, replace the Director of Central Intelligence. I think that it is very important that one does not have, this is independent of any administration, one does not have day-to-day involvement of the White House in the operational matters of the intelligence community. Chairman Specter goes on to say, but Director Deutsch, it would hardly be day to day on the frequency as we project this. And if you have the public insurance of the respective foreign assurance that it is only going to be done with extraordinary circumstances with the president himself or herself, isn't that an added protection that doesn't place too high a burden on the president or too high a cost on operations without really undermining the director's authority? Director Deutsch, I believe, sir, that the president should have the Director of Central Intelligence for whom he or she has trust in. That person's judgment or that person should be replaced. I believe that the president should have an ability to oversee these decisions and come to a different conclusion that he or she so desire. And furthermore, I do not believe that one should have the White House under any, this is not a partisan remark, it is a remark about the occasional and periodic, from time to time, involvement of the White House in a matter like this and in operational intelligence matters is not something that I think is good. I think it should be left to the professional organization to make the initial judgment. But we all understand, sir, that when that judgment is made, there would be immediate notification of both oversight committees. There is not a question about that. So, the other way of having these decisions overseen is by immediate notification of both this committee and the House Oversight Committee. So there is plenty of room here to have the decision overseen by both the legislative and executive branch. Chairman Specter says, well, Director Deutsch, I press you just a little on this because this is going to be a matter to be considered by the Senate, since it is the House provision, or would be a matter of conference if, in fact, the Senate acts on this legislation. When you talk about presidential oversight, do you contemplate the director informing the president of this extraordinary use of intelligence assets? Director Deutsch says, I would think the Director of Central Intelligence would inform the President or Vice President or the National Security Advisor about the action which is taken like this. Chairman Specter asks, so there would be that information? Director Deutsch says yes. Chairman Specter says, well, it is of sufficient importance to inform the President through the National Security Administrator, then National Security Counselor. Then that brings the question up as to whether, if it is going to reach him anyway, if it shouldn't be his decision. But I have your thinking on it, and I think it is important to have the director of the CIA so the Congress can make the informed judgment. When you talk about notification of the intelligence committees of the House and Senate, the current statute has come into some controversy as to how prompt is prompt, how soon is soon. We had a lot of that on Iran-Contra. We had some remedial legislation introduced. I did some in 1987. Senator Cohen did some. Tried to set a parameter of 24 hours. That was never enacted. Would you contemplate in terms of, what would you contemplate in terms of notification to congressional oversight committees? Director Deutsch responds, I would think that from decision time to notification of the chairman and the ranking members, in an instance like this, I think it would be at that level. It would be the chairman and ranking members, 48 hours would be the goal one should have. Chairman Specter says, well, that is very helpful. That might even establish a parameter for other items of notification. Director Deutsch says, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Specter says, well, we appreciate your coming in, Director Deutsch, and appreciate the logic of your position, and we will pursue the details of the policy in closed session. Director Deutsch says, thank you for your courtesy, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Specter, we appreciate you being here. I would like to now call the third panel in alphabetical order. Mr. Kenneth Ullman, Mr. Terry Anderson, Mr. Ted Koppel, Mr. Mortimer B. Zuckerman. Pause. Mr. Chairman, shall I begin? Mr. Adelman. Shall I begin, Mr. Chairman? Chairman Specter says, in a minute. I want to introduce you properly, Mr. Adelman. Mr. Adelman says, thank you. Okay, so, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and break this off here. We'll come back and talk about those media types, and I may end up having to break the clergy stuff up into a third part. But anyway, I hope that you have found this insightful. I've thrown on a few extra clips on the end to kind of help fill in some gaps as to where I'm thinking. And I'm looking forward to getting this next part put together. It's going to take me a few days probably. Life happens. Anyway, catch you on the next one, folks.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish they are true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Colonia Dignidad, or Dignity Colony, was a William Branham cult compound in Chile with a very interesting history. Shortly after William Branham established multiple offices in Germany, about the same time that message cult leader Jim Jones of People's Temple started spreading William Branham's apocalyptic fears and moved to South America for the first time, message cult leader Paul Schaefer moved to Chile and began setting up the commune. By 1963, 230 message believers had migrated to Colonia Dignidad. From there, the history became very dark and has been the subject matter of several movies and documentaries. The compound harbored Nazi leaders that were fleeing to South America, and Colonia Dignidad became known as the Colony to fleeing Nazis. The CIA and Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal claimed to have evidence that Hitler's angel of death, Joseph Mengele, spent time in the Message commune. Message believers in Colonia Dignidad began torturing and killing everyone from opponents of the current political regime to children who disobeyed Branham's cult rules. Worse, the Message believers in Chile were manufacturing and stockpiling weapons of war. When the compound was raided, officials found surface-to-air missiles, rocket launchers, machine guns, submachine guns, hand and cluster grenades, rifles, anti-personnel mines, automatic pistols, and a large amount of ammunition. As the investigation continued, officials found sarin gas and learned that the Message believers were manufacturing chemical and biological weapons. Also found were 500 files on people who had been assassinated in Chile, from political leaders to entertainers. One file had the name John F. Kennedy on it, and inside were 2 bullets of the same caliber that was used by Lee Harvey Oswald in the assassination of JFK. You can learn this and more on william-branham.org.
These are our newly arrived surgeons, Dr. Sturbridge and Greenbaum. Doctor.
I'm from the U.S. government. Does something feel wrong in the world, but you can't put your finger on it? Are you yearning to fight injustice and be part of something bigger? Do you do your own research? If so, you've been chosen to participate in our new PSYOP. QAnon. PSYOPs are usually carried out by our intelligence agencies in countries we've invaded or whose governments we've overthrown, in order to convince the local population that we're there to help them. QAnon is just like that, except the target isn't a foreign population. It's you. And the government we're planning to overthrow is... Follow the White Rabbit. At the heart of this PSYOP is Q, a government insider who will give you advance warning about major events, like the arrest of Hillary and deep state leaders, which never happened, and the end of the Democratic Party in 2018, who actually went on to win the House that year. And if years of fake predictions start to get you down, don't worry. Trust the plan. The best part of this PSYOP is you'll believe you're in a PSYOP, except that's not the PSYOP you're actually in, but the PSYOP where we let you think you're in a PSYOP. PSYOPception. All we have to do is tell Il Duce to say tip-top next to a white rabbit. Q-proof. Joining QAnon is easy, because at its core there are some truths, like the media really does lie to you. There really are powerful predators out there, and there really is a global pedophile ring that ritually abuses kids. But as you follow Q's droppings, you'll gradually LARP yourself deep into the rabbit's rectum, where you'll find others who yearn to fight injustice just like you. The 5G crew, the Plandemic crowd, the FEMA camps, and chemtrail folks too. All LARP together into a single LARP we can control. Where we LARP one, we LARP all. In exchange for all this entertainment and newfound sense of purpose, all we ask for in return is your help. No, you fucking idiots, not to arrest Hillary. You see, we have no intention of ceding power at this election. So if it looks like we're winning on election night, we'll declare victory, even though millions of votes are still being counted. And if we're losing, we'll declare the election rigged. Either way, that's your cue to get in the streets and prevent further mail-in ballots from being counted. Just like what happened in Florida when rioters shut down the recount of the 2000 election. Among those rioters was this fuckwit, the same one who is now urging us to declare martial law should we lose the election. And among the lawyers who helped to stop the recount was the same one we're pushing hard to appoint to the Supreme Court right now. Coincidence? Follow the white fuckwit. All this should alarm patriots. Except Q has convinced patriots, even the guy who spent decades warning you about the police state and martial law. That martial law is now a good thing. The only thing that can ruin our plan to repeat 2000 is if there's an overwhelming voter turnout against us, which is why we've been doing all we can to deregister millions of you, purge voter rolls, and close polling stations to make voting as hard as possible. What's that? When do we take down the deep state? Aw, honey. The guy who exposed the real deep state is being tortured by it right now. And where are you? Oh, that's right. Q told you to trust the plan and have a big circle jerk on Aiken. The great awakening. And that's the purpose of QAnon, to convince those who would normally be on the front line of fighting our shitfuckery to sit by and watch as we prosecute your truth tellers, purge your justice system, and rat fuck this election. QAnon. Nothing can stop what's coming, because you'll be sitting on your ass when it does. Authorized by the Department for executing the biggest intelligence drop in U.S. history.